The Labour government has been meeting with a charity accused of trying to indoctrinate children with pro-asylum seeker open border nonsense. Education ministers met with the Schools of Sanctuary charity 3 times this year. Now, this is a charity that goes into schools and told children as young as 5 years old to write Valentine's Day cards to asylum seekers. Now, why would you do that? Bit weird, isn't it? A Freedom of Information request has revealed shocking new details. During meetings with this Labour government, Schools of Sanctuary were asked to name schools that were refusing to take refugee or asylum seeker children. They were also asked to name schools that were asking parents of foreign children for their immigration documents before admitting them to the school. So hang on a minute. Schools are not now supposed to check whether or not people are in Britain legally before allowing their children to just wander into classrooms. It's remarkable, isn't it? They also suggested that the whole national curriculum should include stories from asylum seeker children to, quote, avoid the ugly scenes of 2024. Well, as far as I'm concerned, that's indoctrination. This charity is already everywhere, really. According to online searches, roughly 600 schools have signed up to this charity. I mean, they want to teach kids about child asylum seekers, do they? Well, what about this one? That's a 30-year-old bloke, pretty much, isn't he? He was a bloke believed to be 30 years old. He claimed to be a child and he was put in a kid's school. I mean, he didn't do anything wrong, but, I mean, I think there is an issue about safeguarding here. I mean, I would argue he did do something wrong, to be perfectly honest with you. He's a 30-year-old bloke in a child's maths class. But anyway, Ahmed Hassan lied about his age. This is another one. Pretended to be a child asylum seeker, tried to blow up the London Underground. Lawan Jean Abdul Ramzai pretended to be 14 years old. That was a lie. He was an adult. He murdered an aspiring Royal Marine in Bournemouth. I mean, when they're in schools telling children to write love letters to asylum seekers, do they tell them about how many of them are paedophiles? I mean, literally today, an Iranian asylum seeker called Amin Mofrad was sent to prison for raping a 15-year-old girl.
The court heard that Mofrad also had 11 previous convictions for assault in Germany before crossing illegally into the country, where he also had a further conviction for theft and was given a community order. But today at Oxford Crown Court, he was jailed by Mrs. Justice Maria Lamb, who told him to be quiet in the dock as Mofrad cried and said that he was innocent and gestured to reporters and said that we were spreading lies. Now, in a statement, Thames Valley Police say that they have achieved justice for this 15-year-old girl who will now begin to rebuild her young life.
OK, it gets worse. This Labour government isn't just meeting with this charity, no, they're also discussing how much public money it would take to help them expand even further. Apparently £45,000 would pay for another full-time member of staff to help them expand their network to as many as 80 different parts of the UK. Now, call me old-fashioned, but when I was at school, I was told to be wary of strangers, not to write a love letter to a random Afghan. Let's get the thoughts of my panel. We have got the Telegraph's Poppy Coburn, Tory peer Lord Bailey and Labour Party advisor former Matthew Larter. Poppy, so this Schools of Sanctuary business meeting with the Labour government, I don't really think should be entertaining this kind of stuff, should they?
No, but it's not an isolated case, unfortunately. You know, I've actually written before in my journalistic career about what I call the charity industrial complex. These left-wing, hyper-political groups, usually around issues of immigration, because that is where a lot of the money is coming from, consulting with the Home Office, consulting with central government, and then when everyone criticises them, they go, well, hang on, we're just a charity, as if they're the same as old ladies standing outside of Tesco trying to raise money for donkeys. Yeah. You know, these are very, very political organisations, and they're using your money to do their activism. I mean, this FOI found that they're currently trying to fill a position, a £45,000 a year position, to speak to more of these schools so they can present more of this ideology they're trying to grow. So I'm glad that you're reporting on this story, because I think more people need to know about this problem.
Absolutely. They just get into schools, they do this stuff, you know, they want to tell all these lovely, fluffy stories about asylum seekers. And the reason for that, I would argue, Sean, anyway, is pretty straightforward. You want to try to indoctrinate kids.
Look, there's two really things the government need to look out for. Firstly, they are highly political, and they're pushing their agenda. And we've seen the curriculum being rewritten and PHAC lessons being rewritten by these charities, and it caused problems before, and the government still seems to not have learned from that. But the really important thing is there's many schools who will accept this charity because they came the way of the education department. Because if you're a head teacher, you're busy, you're trying to make your school run, if something comes from the education department, you just assume, and you should be able to assume it's safe, it's correct, it's been tested. Well, actually, it turns out it isn't. But the real thing for me is particular types of charity, all the right-on charities, all being funded by the public because it's public money. I wonder how much of the public would be happy to fund these things. Probably very few of us.
Well, there you go. I mean, I do think I've got a statement, I believe, from School Sanctuary later on. But I mean, I think they take donations from just general members of the public. I don't think it's all state money. But yeah, Matthew, how do you feel about the idea that a charity that was keen for children as young as 5 to write love letters to asylum seekers, being in more schools? I find that very weird.
Well, I think the Valentine's thing is a bit weird. I think some of the specifics of this raise questions, including whether it's an appropriate use of... I know, as you say, they don't get all the money from the state, but this DFE, it looks like this DFE may be funding a future role, and that seems a bit of a weird use of resources. I think that's perfectly reasonable for kids in schools to learn about different things, including the fact that Britain has always been a country of refuge. If you think back to the kinder transport before the Second World War, or the Huguenots coming across from being persecuted in France for being Protestants. However, I think that needs to be done with care, or indeed Ukrainian, people coming over because of the war. So I think there's a balance to be struck between people teaching history and decency, but not making it overly political.
Earlier today, there's an exclusive on GB News as well, which shows hordes of young men storming through northern French towns on their way to Britain. So when groups like Schools of Sanctuary go into those schools, why don't they tell the kids about these are actually some of the blokes who are on their way to Britain? Why don't they tell them about the paedophiles? Why don't they tell them about the terrorists?
But this is the problem. This is why the political nature of these people is important. Yeah, they claim to be charities, and in their own heads they might believe they're charity, but the government should spot them as being political. And the other thing that annoys me about all of this debate, we seem to be incapable of differentiating between economic migrants and people seeking asylum. There's a very different thing. Asylum seekers, people who are genuinely in danger, genuinely need help, are one thing. People migrating economically is another.
Yeah. But I think there is a fundamental danger here, which is that all children, should be told not to approach strangers. It doesn't matter what colour the stranger is, where the stranger's from. It could be, a bloke happens to be called Paul who lives at the end of the road you've never seen before. It doesn't matter. Children really should be taught to not approach strangers. But in this case, it appears that they are basically being told to go and hug an asylum seeker.
Well, I'm so glad you brought this up. I mean, we're obsessed with safeguarding in this country, right? If you want to go anywhere near a school, you need to do an advanced DBS check, as is correct. We should not have adults being around children unless we know everything about their background, we know they're clear, we know they're safe. And yet, we have had several cases where people who have arrived in this country with no documentation, who have things like facial hair or even receding hairlines, have been placed in schools with no DBS checks placed upon them because it's impossible to do so. It's the hypocrisy here where people in this country pretend they care about children's safety, but then they want to virtue signal more badly, so they'd rather do that instead.
Couple of points on this. That point that I raised earlier on about whether or not, if they're going into schools like this, should they have a duty to also tell them about some of the crimes that some asylum seekers commit? Not all, of course, but that some commit. The second point here is, why has this Labour government met with that charity 3 times this year?
Well, the honest answer to the second question is I don't know. It would seem that there are other meetings that, pressure on diaries, there are other meetings that should be prioritised. On the first point, I think that, at the right age, people should be told the whole story. I think there's a big difference between, say, having a female campaigner from Afghanistan who, has been campaigning for women's and girls' rights in Afghanistan, but maybe now a genuine asylum seeker here, going into a school, telling their story, getting people to think about human rights in various context, rather than sending a love letter or a Valentine's card, not a love letter, Valentine's, randomly. So I think the problem is that when often the case with things like this is that maybe a noble sentiment, but it's done in a political and naive way, and it backfires.
But look, as far as I'm concerned, there are other things that are going on, which, by the way, the school sanctuary, I don't think it's got anything to do with, by the way. But there's other things happening. For example, some schools in rural Scotland are now being taught, primary schools, they're being taught Arabic. And they're being taught Arabic so that they can welcome, quotes, the new Scots. So if you combine that with someone going into the school, doing a kind of school of sanctuary thing, promoting all the refugees business as well, what are you doing there to impressionable, young primary school-aged children?
This is precisely correct. Teaching is political. That's why it needs to be held to a higher standard, OK? You need to give children the facts, but there are issues that you should not be wading into, and I do not trust the capacity of a lot of left-wing teachers and left-wing teaching units to do this properly. I don't believe it. I think they're pushing an ideology which is hyper-political on children.
I think just before we go to those statements, just final question, Sean. I worry as well if a child, as I say, we're talking about a secondary school now, or even a primary school person. There was a story that came out yesterday that said that there's like record numbers of toddlers and primary school pupils who are being reported to prevent, right? So if Schools of Sanctuary, or whoever it is, rocks up and goes, hey, hug an Afghan, and then a kid goes, actually, I want to stop the boat, I think there might be a chance they get reported to prevent.
Of course they would. Look, the whole point about this is you have people on the left who complain about the culture and say it doesn't exist, it's a right-wing construct, but then you see things like this going on, which is firmly in part of the culture war, because what you're trying to do is indoctrinate those kids very, very early on to share your political belief, which I don't believe you have the right to do. What are their parents' political beliefs? Why are we indoctrinating these kids in anybody's political beliefs at this tender age? What they should be doing is learning the 3 R's, not learning this political stuff. But the problem is the Labour Party has become captured by these certain groups, and now that they're in government, the government is captured by these groups. The Labour Party needs to do the right thing, step back and run the country itself, not through these groups.
OK, well, I was going to say a couple of things now. So I saw this information that came out as the result of a Freedom of Information request from the Conservative MP, Nick Timothy. So he posted it out there earlier on. Obviously, we've verified that Freedom of Information request exists, and we've got seen copies of it. But a spokesperson for the Schools of Sanctuary has previously said, we know that false and inflammatory material about Schools of Sanctuary programmes is circulating online. Contrary to what these dangerous misrepresentations claim, our programmes promote compassion, understanding and safety. We have gone back to Schools of Sanctuary, further update on this. Look, I'll preempt that and just say I imagine that they would deny that they are indoctrinating kids. I imagine that's the statement that we will probably get from them. We've also contacted the Department of Education and the Home Office, and we are awaiting a response from both of those groups. Right. Look, lots to go on when we come back. Of course, the very latest on Trump BBC. You'll see the deadline clock on your screen there. Look at that. 23 hours, 37 minutes and 30 bang on seconds now for